you'll see that I have to adjust lower here, of course. Thank you, President Martin. If you haven't had the opportunity to meet President Martin, take the opportunity to welcome to our community. We're really delighted that he's here and supporting our work. My name is Mike Penn, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our October edition of the Florida Lecture Series produced by the Waterfowl Center for Florida History. We had a very difficult week. The hurricane, of course, which is very heavy on people's minds. Many of you obviously have loved ones, and I have very close friends that are really in kind of bad shape right now, not just in Florida, but in North Carolina. And also last week, we lost a very, very significant part of our community when Dr. Sharon Kay passed away last week. She, many of you know, gave her heart and soul to this community. She passed away at 98 last week, and she was named as a Great Floridian. She worked with Rita Childs, down in Florida House on Capitol Hill, which still thrives. Many of her fingerprints are all over this community, and she worked with me very closely to get the center going. She's always there to help me and advise me on things, and she was, of course, on our board of governors as well. So I'd like to take a moment of silence and remember hurricane victims and also Mrs. McKay. If you're with us here for the first time, I want to give you a special welcome and encourage you to get a lecture series brochure and visit Isabel out in the lobby, who has our sign-up sheet for mailing addresses if you'd like to be on our mailing list, and also our email list for future events. We will be having a couple of unannounced and unpublished events this year, so stay in touch with us. Over the years, we've been blessed with wonderful financial support from members of the community. I want to give a special thank you to all of you who donated in our efforts this year and in past years. Donations like yours to keep the programs free and open to the public. Another item you'll find out in the lobby is a brochure with information on the Florida Historical Society. Established in St. Augustine in 1856, the Florida Historical Society is the oldest existing cultural organization in the state. The society is dedicated to preserving Florida's past through the collection and archival maintenance of historical documents and photographs, and it publishes the scholarly journal, the Florida Historical Quarterly, which our speakers publish and many others as well. This past spring, I became president of the society, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about our society. So go grab a brochure and read about it and consider joining. Before I introduce tonight's special guest, I want to say a few things about our upcoming program. Next month, on November 14th, we'll welcome one of our own across the way in Branson 202, and that's Charlie Fanning. Charlie Fanning will come to share with us his research on the transformation of the Florida Everglades after World War II. As I mentioned, he's one of us, he's one of ours. He graduated from FSC with a degree in history in the early 2000s. He worked in Washington and earned his master's degree from Georgetown, and then just recently received his PhD from the University of Maryland. And I'm proud to say he's got a job at the University of Florida. And again, he'll join us on November 14th. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's special guest. In the fall of 1565, Spanish explorer Pedro Menendez de Villas celebrated a feast day of commemoration with his men after their successful landing at the future site of the town of St. Augustine. This celebration had many of the same trappings as what we think of when we recount the story of the first Thanksgiving, celebrated 56 years later in the fall of 1621 by pilgrims in Plymouth Plantation. By focusing on America's Spanish heritage, Kokomoor complicates and sometimes challenges how Americans view their past. He digs deep into Hispanic and Caribbean history and how important happenings elsewhere in the Spanish colonial world influenced the discovery and colonization of the American Southwest, or Southeast. Kokomoor is an Americanist and ethno-historian whose primary research and teaching focuses on the Southeast and the native Southeast, the early Republican and Federalist eras, and ideas of frontiers and also borderlands. He's an award-winning scholar and is published in the Journal of Southern History, the Georgia Historical Review, and the Florida Historical Quarterly. And last May, his wonderful book, I don't know if there's any copies of that way to be honest with you. They were selling like hotcakes. But if there are, you want to get one because it is a terrific read. It is incredibly well written, and as I mentioned, it won the Florida Historical Society's Charles DeVoe Award. So, a Florida native, Kokomoor holds degrees from USF and Florida State University, and teaches early American history at Coastal Carolina University in Conway, South Carolina. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kevin Kokomoor to our stage.
Thank you very much. Again, real quick before I begin, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to President Martin and to Dr. Denham. It really is a great pleasure. I moved away to teach, but I will always consider myself a Floridian. We come from a family that's not that far away from here, and so this is something that is a product of what I teach, but it's also very special to me. And so I think, hopefully you pick up on that when you're moving through it. It is also something that I tried to write to engage with as many people as possible, to try to get people to understand a more complicated history of the Southeast and of American history. And so with that, this talk is in support of that book. But it is a very wide-ranging book. It is more it's more topical and thematic than it is chronological. So I can't cover, everything. It jumps from currents to Catholicism to natives to oranges to pigs, and then it is a book that really tries to weave into early American history the Spanish presence. And I make sure to say in the intro that I am not some sort of neo-colonialist that's trying to make the Spanish sound like, this is not a triumphant story of the Catholic faith or of Spanish conquistadors. But the point here is that it was a very powerful colonizing process, Spanish colonialism. And it is still visible in a lot of ways. And in order to sort of project that, in order to sort of explain that, I do lecture with a lot of images. I like to reflect, so you'll see me walk back and forth. Again, it's more thematic than chronological. So it talks about connections. What connects Florida? What connects La Florida was not just the peninsula of Florida. La Florida was Spain's claim to North America. And so keep in mind that, when we're talking about La Florida, we're not just talking about the peninsula of Florida, but what are the connections from La Florida elsewhere, to the Caribbean, to slavery, to Catholicism? What are some of the origin stories? What brought colonizers here? Transformations. How did their presence here transform the Southeast? And I mean that, that's a euphemism in a lot of ways for the demographic collapse of the Southeast. Again, this is not always a building process. And also, what are some of the legacies that you can still see? So, in some ways, it circles back from section to section, and it really tackles sort of like important areas, important connections, important origins, the ways that transformed the Southeast, and the ways that you can see that still today. And so, I will give credit, obviously, where credit is due to other historians and anthropologists and archaeologists. This is the work of John Worth at the University of West Florida. I don't use it in the book, but it really shows you just the complicated, multi-generational, hundreds-year history of attempts to colonize Florida. All sorts of colors, all sorts of conquistadors, most of which failed, most of which actually died. And I want to use that to show our first set of connections. I want to run through the Florida Peninsula, and I want to try to give an example or two of each one of those sections I talked about. I want to talk about connections, I want to talk about origins, I want to talk about transformations, and then lastly I want to talk about legacies. So, the connections. How about the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico? And I know that was not obviously designed this way, but we have all felt the connection of Florida's establishment to the natural world in the past 2 months. It has come home to all of us because the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean is tied to a seafaring, a maritime history. It is a connection to the seafaring and maritime history that leads to one after another attempt to settle Florida. When everyone dies in the Pamphilo de Narvaez expedition, you send another. When the Hernando de Soto expedition fails, you send another and another and another. And, you know, why, right? In a lot of ways, it's connected to the world. And when I teach the history of, like, emerging Spaniards, the emerging Portuguese, why is it that the age of exploration is driven by the Spanish and Portuguese? If you look at the world's, if you look at the Atlantic current systems, and if you look out into the Atlantic, where are the Azores, where are the Canaries, where are the Cape Verdes, where are the Madeiras? Why are they all Spanish and Portuguese overseas territories? Because the Spanish and the Portuguese are the ones that are trying to get around Africa, to get to the spice trade, to basically compete with the Italians, right, who are winning in the spice trade. In order to do that, they are the ones that basically invent this seafaring sort of tradition. Moving from lateen rig sails that are very good about moving into the wind. Well, they basically begin building ships that have square rigged sails that catch more of the wind. They basically invent long haul cargo ships. And when they do that and they push out, they begin to discover current and wind systems. And I know discovery is a dangerous word to use from their perspective. Obviously, they were discovering something that clearly existed before them. But what they have figured out is that when you push off the coast, you are unlocking a current system and a wind system. And that gets you to what they refer to as the Atlantic Islands, the Canaries, the Azores, the Cape Verdes, down off the doldrums. And what you figure out there is that you have westerlies that will take you back from west to east. You have prevailing trades that will take you from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean. And we all know this in the 21st century because the northeast trades and the horses, that is exactly how hurricanes get here. They take the same winds. They use the same waters. And so what the Spanish and the Portuguese are doing is they're trying to get around the Horn of Africa, and they are trying to dominate the spice trade, which eventually they do. The Portuguese do. In the Treaty of Tordesillas, they get basically one half of the world, and it's insane to say that one country claims one half of the world, but they will claim everything basically, you know, between the Philippines and Brazil, because they want the spice trade, and the Spanish basically get everything else. And that sets up another connection. We're talking about whoever discovers this, whoever manipulates it, whoever masters it, they will be the ones that will get to the Caribbean. Because, you know, whether you're alive or dead on that ship, you know, you can't really turn around. It's going to end up in the Bahamas, which is exactly where Columbus's ship ends up. And when we zoom in and we say, well, if we get into a little more detail, once you manipulate the currents and the wind systems, then you get to understand an even more detailed set of currents and winds. Not so much winds, but currents. All of the water from the Atlantic current, or I think AC is the Antilles current, that moves above sort of the island of Cuba. CC means Caribbean current. All of the water that enters the Caribbean has to leave through the Caribbean current, through the Yucatan current, up into the Gulf of Mexico, where if you pop a left, it becomes the Mexican current, MC, moves up the west coast of Mexico, where Veracruz is. It turns like a washing machine in the center of the Gulf of Mexico, in what we now call the Lou current, And this becomes a really powerful current in the 21st century because of, I got some really excellent images because of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The oil caught the loop current, and that's how you ended up with oil all the way down the west coast. Because these currents, I mean, they manifest. They're always in your life if you're in the Gulf of Mexico. FC stands for the Florida Current. GS means the Gulf Stream. And what you begin to understand here, and Spanish mariners really begin to understand this, they begin to understand that this is a reliable system. It is a dangerous system because if you were sailing anywhere in the Caribbean in the past month, you would have died because of that hurricane. And you don't have early warning. You have a barometer, and when the pressure drops, it basically means that you're all going to die, right? Because you can't sail away faster than that storm. The best that you can do is possibly beach your boat, right? And so, why settle Florida? There are reasons to attempt La Florida. There are Catholic reasons. You are a conquistador. We'll actually talk about the conquistador sort of ethos in a little bit. But think about just absolute strategy. Why are so many attempts to settle Florida along the coast? Because Florida, the coast of Florida, is a necessary part of a world system. You have to sail between Cuba and the Keys. You have to sail between West Palm Beach and the Bahamas. You absolutely have to. There is no other way to leave. This is how the treasure fleets bring back all of the exploited wealth of the New World, are literally packed onto boats and shipped back into the open Atlantic. They have to transit these very narrow, very dangerous current systems, and Florida is a death trap, the coastline. And so when Pedro Menendez de Avila settles all of these places, what do all of those black dots along the coast of Florida represent? You are there to proselytize to the natives. Yes, you are. But you are also there to protect the shipping of the Spanish world. And that explains why St. Augustine exists. St. Augustine is the one that remains. All of these examples have strategic value. This is why the Spaniards will not give up on Florida, even though there is no obvious wealth there. Because by the middle of the 17th century, it's not about obvious wealth in Florida. It's about protecting the obvious wealth everywhere else. Because you have to sail through that. And storms happen, and pirates happen, and that is a very treacherous, very necessary route. And so we have connections. We have a connection between Florida and world history and maritime history. And this, it sets off our first ages of piracy, the 16th century and the 17th century. All piracy is, when you hear I'm a pirate of the Spanish Main, that means you're around there somewhere, trying to make money off of Spanish treasure fleets. That's why Roanoke exists. That's why the French exist. The attempt at St. Augustine is only successful after you destroy the French attempt at Fort Caroline, who are pirates. So in all of these examples, in one way or another, these are examples. I could continue to go on. We're going to move on here in a second. But you think of like the Black Line, which is Juan Pardo in the 1570s. And you'll see that he actually gets all the way up into Tennessee, which is why La Florida is much more than Florida. But you see where he stops right there in eastern Tennessee. And he stops there because that's where the mountains are. And he's like, he thinks that he is marching to Mexico. And I think it's right around the mountains of East Tennessee when he realizes that he's nowhere near Mexico. And he's got to turn around. I mean, that's actually why the Spanish have no idea how large the continent is. They don't know that there's two different mountain ranges in their way. Even that crazy little attempt right there, the black lines with the dots go all the way up into upstate South Carolina and western North Carolina. That is an attempt to get around Florida so that no one ever has to sail through the treacherous Florida Straits ever again. So when you look at this set of connections, everything that you see there, most of it at least, not everything, most of it you see there has a direct connection to something happening somewhere else in what is becoming the British Empire. And that's your connection. Is it Florida? I like to joke with my students who are in Myrtle Beach, and I say, in the 21st century, who has been in Central or South Florida before? Who's been to Miami before? And a lot of people raise their hands. That's like a really hot spring break destination right now. So everyone goes to Fort Lauderdale. But, you say, when you go to Fort Lauderdale, do you get the impression that you're in the American South? Probably no. Right? Most students will say, you get the impression you are not in the southern limits of the South. You are in the northern limit of the Caribbean. And in this instance, Florida really is a northern extension of the Caribbean. Right? So I offer you first connections through the treasure fleets in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. I also offer origins, a different look at the same map. I said most of it had to do with strategy. The ones that don't, and forgive me if I come off, I don't really know what these colors are. I'm guessing light blue. That is, I'm saying that's a light blue. That's Pamphile de Narvaez, 1528. And then the sort of, magenta, pink, whatever that is the legendary Hernando de Soto Entrada. And so, what is the origin story here? What are the connections and origins? If I was to tell you that every one of these lines has a backstory that exists further back than Florida. These guys didn't just show up here for no reason. They are all hidalgos. They are all sons of somebodies. They are the upward mobile warrior culture of Spain. They have spent the last 800 years fighting non-Christians in Spain. That's how their families have gained power and nobility and money and land. And when 1492 happens, right? The Reconquista has ended. The war is over. And 1492 happens, and a whole new world opens up of non-Christians who are apparently walking around covered from head to toe in silver and gold. These guys are coming over. Every one of those lines represents someone who had a history before Florida. The red one, Juan Ponce de Leon, 1513 and 1521. He was an encomendero on Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. He was already a guy who knew the Caribbean and wanted more. The darker green one, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, he was an encomendero on Hispaniola. He already was winning and he wanted more. They wanted the next one. What is the next one? What is the next one? The light blue one, he fought Hernan Cortez from Mexico and lost. So he is real bitter. He wants what he thinks is rightfully his. He wants his own conquest. And obviously the magenta one, the purple one, the pink one. That's Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto was a captain under Francisco Pizarro. That guy was in the room with Atahualpa when they legendarily filled it with gold and silver. He's already rich. Why would he risk his life to finance an entire expedition? All of these guys had a taste of conquest, and they all wanted more. They wanted their names to be up with Cortez and Pizarro. They wanted to be the next Pizarro. We even have stories. Right around in upstate South Carolina on the Wateree River, De Soto walks into Confetechique, and I use this as the intro to the first chapter. And he's showing his rings to the lady of Confetechique, and he says, "That's gold, that's silver. Where's the gold? Where's the silver?" And she says, "All right, I'll bring you out gold and silver." And he is just, he is so happy. And then it's copper, it's useless. And then she says, "Hey, we have all these pearls." And apparently this place is just absolutely chock full of freshwater pearls. And all of the guys with the Soto are like, this is what you want. And he's like, no, I did not come all the way here for pearls. I want gold and silver. He says that. He says, I came here to replicate successes elsewhere. And so we have the first generations of Spanish conquest, or attempted conquest, of pacification, of colonization. They are now overlapping connections and origin stories that have different corners of the Spanish Empire involved. The second one's cultural in nature. These guys won't give up. They are insanely touchy, violent, rich, ambitious. They are willing to stake their reputations. And every one of them is coming to Florida having already been moderately successful, but they want to be the next big thing. They want to be the next De Soto. They want to be the next Francisco Pizarro. In this instance, the attempted settlement of Florida is a extension of conquest elsewhere. In every single way, in every single chapter, what happens in the southeastern United States has Spanish threads to it. By the way, I will tackle a few primary sources, only a few, well, only short, because I know with my students, just the light just leaves their eyes. When you give them more than like 2 sentences, they just will get up and walk away on you. So I try not to, but I want to integrate maybe a couple sentences here and there, and I want to say, well, how do we move from there to transformations? How are we talking about transformation? So these guys show up on horses. Lusitanos, Barbs, I forget, these North African, Italian, Spanish, Andalusians. They have these, they sit, it's been a really, really long time since I've been on a horse, so maybe I'm exaggerating, but you're sitting about that high, which means you're about 10 feet high. They are covered in chainmail, they're covered in armor, their horses are covered in armor. They have basically canary corsos next to them, they're 200 pounds, they're covered in armor, right? And they have these unique lances. And all of this represents something historically that we call the Columbian Exchange. And it's really hard to put into words what this means to a Native American to see basically metal-clad, we don't have metal, on horses, don't have horses, right? It's really hard to imagine what 20 guys on horses covered in armor with lances. Yeah, the idea is, yes, they had guns. They had, early versions of guns, wildly inaccurate. You don't even need that, right? Because what we have in the primary record are Spaniards on horses with body armor on, with lances. And again, you have a lance that's about 8 feet long. It's not so much a sword, it's not so much an axe, as it is a lancing instrument like that you lance from on a horse. In the Revolution, they would switch over to these curved cavalry swords that can just, hack your arm off, and it's just really brutal. In the 16th century, they had these lances. And the natives have the best technology that they have. They don't wear body armor. Why is that? There's really not a whole lot that you need to be protected from. And there are arrows, and they use them, but Native American warfare is fundamentally different. In Native American warfare, you attack in very small groups by surprise, you capture, you hold people ransom, you integrate them, you kill them. It is a very personal thing on a very small scale. And this is why you would hear these traders say, the natives were going to club me, or they were going to knock me on the head. Well, you see a Timucua warrior on the right with a gigantic war club. If I was to use some anthropological side-streaming skills and say, well, they actually really did use war clubs. These are Eastern Iroquois war clubs. That's a big old hickory war club. And so when you say, I'm going to knock you on the head, that's what that means. That's how natives fight. They don't wear body armor. If they do, it's leather. And so we have, in North America, in Florida, I give you a massacre that happens just north of here. And this is from the DeSoto Chronicles. He says, immediately those who were in the houses in the town, both foot and horse, attacked the Indians, who were so surprised that their greatest thought was where they could escape. The men on the horse rushed the Indians. If you're a native with a war club and you have 5 guys on horses lined up in a cavalry formation, rushing you with lances, what are you going to do? You cannot defeat that. Right? They just run away. You can run them down. There is no way that you can defeat that. Right? One of which was that of the governor. They killed a couple horses, who was immediately provided with another. 30 or 40 Indians were lanced. So in this one battle, they say it in such passing that it almost doesn't even mean something. To say, when somebody was lanced, that means from the top of their horse, he lanced down right through the center of them, dropped them dead immediately. And in this battle, they are talking about an absolute rout of a Native American force that did not stand a chance because you have a technological advantage, right? I think Gerald Melanich a long time ago was like, you are rolling Sherman tanks on them right now. They have nothing that you can compete with. In fact, there is a larger primary source. It tells the story. I mean, it's almost patronizing. When they're in the battle, another battle in Florida, this guy runs out, he saves his wife, and he runs out, and he challenges like 3 or 4 of these horsemen. And the horsemen, he's got his big hickory bow, and he runs up on him and he starts bashing him in the head with his bow. I mean, this guy is aggressive, and he is warlike, and he is defending his family, and these guys are just discounting him. They use their horses and knock him over and basically trample him, and they say, hey, you are so honorable, we're not going to kill you. But this guy is poking at their horses from underneath. He's taking out arrows and shoving them up underneath the horse. He takes his bow and hops up and bashes one of the Spaniards in the head with his bow. It makes him bleed. He breaks his nose. And the Spaniards say, I'm done with this guy. And you know what they did to him? 1 second, he says, lance. It went out the other side, just right through the chest. Dropped him in 2 seconds. It's like that guy gave it everything that he had, and it just patronized them. And so when you ask, in what ways does a Spanish presence start to really mess up this world. The Colombian Exchange is an excellent example of it. There are all these historical sort of scenarios. How could Francisco Pizarro with 200 guys have captured Atahualpa, right? How could Hernan Cortez have marched into Mexico City? It's not all the horses, but you got to think about stuff like this. I have another source that we talk about when I talk about the women, right? Women, native societies are matrilineal, which means the family line runs through the mother, not the father. And we have this story that happens right outside of Tampa, actually, but in the Hernando de Soto expedition, and says the natives snatched up one of my guys and drug him into a huge cane brake. And there's this Native American cane that's not as everywhere it used to be, but a cane brake is just a wall of what you consider North American bamboo. And they said it scared us. We sent a bunch of cavalry in, and what did we find? They had hid all the women and children in this cane brake. And all of the Spaniards rushed in to grab their lost colleague, and they ended up coming out with dozens and dozens of men and women. And they say, oh, look how the fortunes of war have changed, right? They say it so tongue-in-cheek and passing. It's so flippant, the way the chroniclers talk about this. And if you break that down ethno-historically and say, if you kill a man, you don't kill much. If you kill a young woman, you kill off the entire future bloodline of that clan lineage. Because family lines run through women, which is why they hid the women in the cane brake. And you stumbled upon them, you snatched up 20 women and 30 young children, and you basically clapped them in chains and marched them off, and they will never come back. What have you just done to that town? You have annihilated that town. That town no longer exists. The clan lineage of that town is dead. Do Spaniards know that they're doing this? Right? No. Do they care? Absolutely not. When they come in and they use stuff like that, they destroy the Mississippian world, right? They are in the presence of tipping the Mississippian world upside down. And I use this as an example of the transformations. One of the transformations and legacies. There's a friar in the Caribbean. His name is Bartolomé de las Casas, and he writes this book, The Destruction of the Indies. And it becomes the source base for what we refer to as the Black Legend of Spanish conquest. And it is one of the grossest, darkest books that you will ever read. It is just one list of massacre after massacre after massacre. He's shaming the Catholic Church into the destruction of the natives. And this right here is a Theodore de Bry engraving of Hernando de Soto that was included in what we now call, right? There is a Florida chapter to the destruction of the Indies. Florida is included in the barbarism of Spanish colonialism that still sort of exists in the 21st century, right? And you would say, yeah, you know, how much of this is propaganda? How much of this is the British or the French? How much of this is Protestants hating on Catholics, right? It could be a lot, and there's a lot to that. At the same time, what's the other leg? What's the other leg of transformations? What's the other leg of the Columbian Exchange? Henry Dobbins in the 80s and 90s comes out with these numbers that are just absolutely apocalyptic to describe the collapse of Florida. It says maybe 1 million people lived in Florida. Well, after 1510, smallpox kills 50%. And then another 30% from typhus. And then another 30% from malaria. This is all untested stuff. And I'll use my second and my last primary source. We don't know what happens in Florida. We don't know why the Mississippian world collapses. Destroying communities is an excellent example, but disease is the most obvious example. Historians have gone back and forth and say, no, there's no way that it could be 99% mortality in Florida. But there aren't a whole lot of natives left in Florida, right? And so I use the Dobbins numbers and say maybe they're correct, maybe they're not. Here is the one last primary source that I'll give you, and I'll read it out. And this is from Pánfilo de Narváez. He is up in Florida in the 1520s. He is in Ayute, which is basically now St. Mark's, Tallahassee, right? And he says, the following day we departed from Ayute and marched the whole day. The journey was difficult in the extreme, because neither the horses were sufficient to carry all the sick, nor did we know what the remedy to seek was, because every day they languished, right? Which was a spectacle of very great sorrow and pain to see. Having arrived and seen a little prospect, we didn't even know what to do. And even if there had been prospect, the men could not have gone because most of them were ill and in such a state. You know, what's he saying here? He's saying these guys are so ill and so sick that we couldn't even carry them. And he's in Tallahassee in 1528. Do we know what that is? We don't know what that is. They just could have been marching through the South in the summertime wearing wool and madian. They just could have been roasting to death. It might not have been sickness at all. But they very well could be sick. That's the only primary source that we have for that. Right? Some unnamed sickness that may or may not even be sickness. But we know that perhaps that was probably, a fever. And if that's a fever, and you're spreading it through a Mississippian society in the South, that's not good for the demographic numbers of the South. That is the kind of stuff that could legitimize a number like that. Even something simple like influenza would have a 30% mortality rate. So we have transformations. By the way, they're not the only ones. We have the mission system, leads to incredible demographic collapse through Florida, year after year after year. Numbers dwindle down into the thousands. What are the Spanish friars known for bringing? They bring pigs, they bring cows, they bring oranges. We know that when William Bartram, the famous naturalist, moves down the St. John's River in the 1760s and 1770s, the guy can't throw a rock without hitting oranges. Oranges are not from Florida. Spaniards bring oranges. They just grow really well in Florida. He says, where I'm at right now, there's cows everywhere. Where I'm at right now, there's deer and pigs everywhere. I like to use pigs as an example of the Columbian Exchange because Spaniards love pigs. Everywhere in the world Spaniards go, there is some sort of pig culture. A pig is a colonizing machine. It's impossible to kill them. They eat everything. They reproduce rapidly. That's why you go anywhere in the Spanish world. You chicharron, lechon, there's pig dishes everywhere because of the Spanish. Well, they bring pigs in the southeast, and DeSoto says, hey, I landed with 12 pigs in Tampa. By the time he gets to St. Louis, he's got like 500. Who knows how many escaped here or there? We know he gives them away. Do you know what a pig will do to corn? They will destroy corn. What happens when your community exists off of corn? And they run through in April when the corn is just this high and so succulent and sweet to a deer or a pig. They will annihilate it. And when that happens, you will starve to death. Right? Do the Spaniards intend to starve natives to death? No, but does that happen? Probably. So the transformations, euphemism for demographic collapse. Right? When Charleston comes into existence in 1670, there's this death struggle between the British in Charleston and the Spanish in St. Augustine, between Protestants, Anglicans, and the Catholics. And the Charlestonians absolutely win, and they take it out on the native population of the Floridas. They sweep down and just absolutely devastate all the Spanish missions. Whoever is left is just gone by the middle of the 18th century, the 1700s. In fact, I love a good map, and you look at these really beautiful maps, and I think this is the crisp map. So this will show Charleston if I showed a different part of it. And there's a line that goes north to south, right through the peninsula of Florida. And it says, if you zoom in, the road of the Creeks going to war with the Floridians. Here the Carolina Indians leave their canoes when they go to war with the Floridians. Here's where I transition to my last point. I know I'm starting to run out of time. Well, how about legacies? Well, we're in Central Florida. Used to be oranges all over here. Not so much. There used to be cattle all over here. There are pigs all over here. Right? You can't. There's nothing that we can do about that. But all of these transformations, it leads to the last one. Right? When we talk about the ethnogenesis of the Southeast, we're talking about the creation of a native identity. In this case, the same Creeks that come from somewhere else to raid and destroy the native territory, a group of them. In about the 1750s, a group of Creeks come down and they love the area around Gainesville, from Gainesville right down to here in Central Florida. They love it so much, they stay there. They are not from there, they are from Georgia. They are Creek Indians. But yet they become Seminoles. And the term for them is Cimarrone, runaway. Seminoles are runaway Creeks who come down into Florida, and they like it so much there that they stay permanently, and they become known as those who run away. Right? Seminoles are Creeks. And you say, why would a Creek leave its ancestral homeland on the Alabama River and go to Alachua and stay there forever? Well, we have, William Bartram says, cows. There's cows all over the place. The leader of the first Seminole band, the Alachuas, he calls himself the Cowkeeper. Right? In fact, I have a colleague who does Seminole history, and the title of his dissertation was a quote from the Seminoles in the 17th century, or the 18th century. He says, "We have always been cow people." Seminole identity is intertwined with cows. That's literally the reason why they come down here. They say there are so many freaking cows down here. They don't belong to anyone. They belong to us now. In fact, in a chapter of the book, I introduce it with, there's Payne's Prairie right there. That's present-day Gainesville. He's named after the son of Cowkeeper. And he says, I'm hanging out, and soon after sunrise, a party of Indians on horseback appeared onto the same savanna to collect together several herds of cattle, which they drove along their camp towards the town. One of the party came up and informed us that the cattle belonged to the chief of Kuskawia, that had ordered some of the best steers of his droves to be slaughtered for a general feast. He came at the right time. Bartram writes like 10 pages about the best beef barbecue he's ever had in Gainesville in 1776. Right? Because he says the Seminoles are cow people. He says there's no one scarier than a Seminole guy on a horse. I mean, they're like part of the horse. When you think of like the Plains Indians that, are like one with the horse, and they're just basically born on the horse. Well, you have the Seminole here. They wouldn't exist in Florida. Think about the legacy there. The Seminole are a product of all of this destruction. They are a product of the collapse of the Mississippian world. They are the ones that destroyed the Mississippian world, right? They are a product of the attempted colonization of Florida. Spanish friars brought the oranges. They brought the cows. They brought the pigs, right? And so in this instance, we have all of these amazing legacies in Florida. If you go to most of the legacies in Florida, they all have Spanish threads. And the most obvious example is the creation of the Seminole people. The Seminole literally mean runaway. And so I offer all of these examples, right, of legacies that you can see in Florida today. And so to wrap it up, right, we have connections. The Caribbean world. We have connections and origins. The Spanish are here to make money, for power, for wealth. We have transformations. They bring technology. They bring colonization. They try to do this. They don't try to do this. Whether they try or don't try, it still has the devastating impact on the Southeast. But in the end, you still see oranges. You still see cattle. You still see Seminoles. And so I hope that you're getting sort of like, it's not a triumphant story. It is a story that still resonates. And what I hope that you'll get is that in all of these ways, in all of these threads, it's not the only story of the Southeast, but it is an additional story of the Southeast that provides the Southeast with a lot of really excellent complexity. Right? By bringing the Spanish in, you add this level of complexity. You add all of these different voices. You add all of these different experiences that it would not be the South without them. It would not be Florida without them. And so I'll close with that. And I think I've gone over a little bit, but I think that we have some time for some questions. If anyone has any questions, I think we're right on the dot actually. So let me hand it over to you guys if anyone has any questions. Mike, do you want to?
Yes. Well, how about that? Got a microphone here.
I can sit to the podium if you want to use this one.
Is it going to work? I think somebody up there has to put it on there. Okay. Any questions? I can bring the microphone over to people. Okay.
Would you speculate at all as to when we reflect on the origins of American history, we tend to attribute most of our history to
last part of that question?
We tend to contribute most of our histories as the settlement of America, or the establishment of America, to English history, English settlements, like Jamestown and so on. But we give little credit, or less credit, it seems, to the Spanish influences.
Well, that is, I don't come out with a thesis that explains why exactly that is. That's a tough one, and it's complicated. And if I was to make a really educated guess, it's just, you could crack a joke about how weird and wild Florida has always been. But, when you think of Americanness, it's Protestant. It is New England, right? It is, that is a very triumphant story of the Protestant faith. It's a triumphant story of perseverance. It is something that over time sort of created a unique American identity. It just, is there a exact moment when that we decide to forget that? I don't think that that's done on purpose. It's just not taught because it doesn't fit with, the whole idea is, I call it an American almost mythology, and that is your original identity. And it is a very important identity. It is. But my counter to that is that it's not the only one. And I'm not trying to poke anyone in the eye here and say that, New England is, unimportant. It certainly is, right? The Spanish did not bring democracy here, right? They did not bring a legislative body here where, you voted on stuff. I'm not trying to hold the Spanish up as the first true Americans, but I think to answer your question, which is when you feel like what is American, it's everything that sort of like that New England experience stands for. That has been crafted over time.
Can you talk about the Catholic part of things? Did the Conquistadores tend to bring Jesuit priests with them? Any type of religious persons with them?
That is, that's about 4 different chapters of this book. If I was to, yes, it is an absolute. It is a very important. It is a very. It's a problematic part of this book. Is that, for instance, there are a set of bulls that are basically referred to now as the bulls of donation that more or less give Spaniards basically from the Catholic Church license to either convert or subjugate non-Christians, right? And that is something that they take with them. That's actually something that a physical piece of paper, which is called a requirement, which is actually physically read, right? It's so absurd, it's almost like, it sounds like it's a joke. The requirimiento, right? It is just a piece of paper that says, this is Christianity, you have to accept it or we will destroy it, right? And it will be your fault. It is.
And the Native Americans, in formal process, they would read it to them as if they could understand it in Latin, right?
It's in Latin, and it's like,
It was really kind of ridiculous.
And I think I write in the book.
They got cause to kill them.
I think I write in the book. It's like if Martians landed and started reading off something in Martian. You would understand it, but that's really the point. Like Mike just said, is that what you're looking for is someone to basically say no, and not saying yes is saying no. And once they say no, then you have gained legal authority to basically seize them, seize their property, seize their persons. That is something that is ingrained. That's actually something that is taught to the Spanish during the Conquista. It was actually something that was forced on them that they used. So I would argue that's one example of the Catholic Church has a tremendous part to play in this. When Pedro Menendez de Avila settles St. Augustine, he does so right after he just annihilates French Protestants called Huguenots. In fact, that's the opening of the book. The opening of the book is what is the first Thanksgiving. He sits down and says, "Thank you for all of the non-Catholics that we just killed." Right? That is the first Thanksgiving. It is a really horrible Thanksgiving story, and it shows you the centrality of the Catholic Church in all of this. It plays a formative role, very much so, and all throughout the Catholic. Even when that era of conquest is over, then the era of missionizing begins. So the Catholic thread runs all the way through the book.
Kevin, talk about the encomienda, the way that works. That's really kind of the next step in that, isn't it?
I will. There is a part of this book that I talk about myths, And it is probably the one part of the book where I do intentionally poke Floridians in the eye. And I will say that because I am a Floridian too, so I'm poking myself in the eye. But when I say that Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón is an encomendero in Hispaniola, and if I go back, and I'll try to do it without wasting too much time, but you can draw a straight line. And we have the primary sources for this. We have the primary sources to show that getting to Florida may actually have been an accident. But where do you go first? All of these guys hopscotch every single island in the Caribbean, looking for human beings to snatch up to send back to Hispaniola. And that is because, whether it is from exploitation or disease, the population of Hispaniola has plummeted. The population of the Bahamas is being enslaved until it does no longer exist. And every one of these conquistadors goes further and further and further until they find the next island, which turns out to be Florida. And I use that as an example of a myth or a counter myth. Because what we are all taught as Floridians is, why did Juan Ponce de Leon land here? The fountain of youth. He never said that. No one ever said that. That is a complete and utter myth. No one ever said that. You know, why would you want to teach someone that? Why did Juan Ponce de Leon really come here? He is looking for people. And Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón does the exact same thing. When he lands right where I teach now in Coastal Carolina, he is hiring slave raiders to slave the Bahamas. No one knows that South Carolina is not just another Bahamian island. They land there, and what do they immediately do? They snatch up 60 Chicora Indians, and they basically immediately sail back to Hispaniola. Right? And the encomienda system is what brings Spaniards over. You're not going to get gold, you're not going to get silver. What you can get is an allotment of land and control over the natives on that land. They are not technically slaves because the crown accepts their humanity, but they can pay you tribute. And you will make them pay you tribute until they drop dead. And then you will look for more. And the encomienda system brings Spaniards here. The only problem is that there are no populations dense enough to basically attempt an encomienda. So they do in St. Augustine. But the encomienda system is also a connection. It is a very important connection. That is the economic system that brings Spaniards over, and they are looking to extend that. They read the requirement, and they have in their hand a contract, the capitulación, signed by the king that says, you are the adelantado, you are the governor, you get to make allotments of encomiendas. That's in the paperwork. They would have done it if they could have. They just don't.
I do have a question. So, with all of these Spanish conquistadors, what would be the positive impact and legacy they left us?
I mean, that's a difficult question. That's a complex question. I'm not trying to. It is a transformative period of colonization, and if you teach Native history, and indigeneity, this is tough stuff. This is, what I'm saying is exploration for exploitation. And that's very difficult. And I think that part of this, there is a slight revisionism in here that says that this is not a triumphant story. It is a problematic story. That's not easy to answer. I'm not saying that there's nothing positive ever that came out of Spanish contact. I mean, you can look around and say, cattle in Florida, the Seminole identity. Is that positive? It's complicated. It's complicated. In the field right now, which really stresses Native American resilience, the answer to North America is that North America is not destroyed. Native North America is not widowed, as Dobbins said back in the day, right? It was fundamentally transformed. And it required a tremendous amount of violence and destabilization. And that's hard to explain as a positive thing. I'm not going to shy away from saying, this is not an attempt to create some sort of positive influence of the Spanish. It is just to say that it is an important influence. It's something that needs to be understood.
You can
Kevin.
I would say that there's actually, if you wanted to get a little more detailed about it, there's actually two real waves. The first wave of sort of exploration, pacification, conquest, colonization is the Caribbean, and that ends up kind of being a little bit of a, I guess you could say almost a little bit of a letdown, because they're looking for easy, obvious sources of wealth and land, and they're not finding that on Hispaniola. There's only so much gold on Hispaniola. And the Caribbean is this jumping point to go to what is now Venezuela and Colombia and Panama. And obviously, as nation states, they didn't exist back in the day. They would refer to that as the mainland or something like that. And what you have is a second generation. From Hispaniola, you have Cortez heading over to Veracruz, and he hears all these things about Mexico. And what he basically topples is a highly stratified, urban, powerful, complex society with about 10 million people in it. And that is what opens up the idea of the encomienda, because he's a marquis with 100,000 square miles of land, and that opens up an encomienda system that will draw people in. And I guess the point is that at that point, it is exploitation of the natives where they are, and that brings Spaniards over. That's the whole point of the encomienda system, is to use them to make money, however you want. It could be tobacco, it could be rum. In central Mexico, it could be growing wheat or cattle or mining. And that really is the connection, because the Spaniards want that again. They want another Peru. Because when Pizarro goes to Peru, my God, it's even bigger than central Mexico. It's like 10 million people. There's silver mines. It's a complex society that you can easily manipulate just by killing one guy. It is, and you create, there's like 700 encomenderos in Peru alone in the next 20 years. And so that is the dragon that all Spaniards are chasing from that point on. They want, and like I said earlier, Hernando de Soto says I didn't come here for pearls. I came here to be De Soto. And so that second generation is the one that really has a lot of importance in the attempted colonization of Florida, because that's when everyone, you have to think, that map is covered with Mississippian societies, where you have godlike chiefdoms living on top of the mountain. Everything looks exactly the same as it looked in Mexico City. Except there just happen to be gold mines in Mexico City, and there's no gold mines in Georgia. Everyone thinks that they have the ticket to the next Mexico City. And that's why things get more and more violent. De Soto's like, where's the gold? Where's the gold? Where's the gold? Everything is the same. You claim to be a god. You live on top of a pyramid. And all these chieftains are like, yeah, everything. But we don't do gold. We don't have gold here, right? And everyone is obsessed. All of these Spaniards are obsessed with the next Mexico, because they are able to manipulate that population. So no, they are not enslaving natives and shipping them to the Caribbean. They are building a world, a colonial world in Mexico City. Tenochtitlan becomes Mexico City. Lima is power, and this is where they're digging gold out of the ground. This is where they're butchering cattle. This is New Spain. Does that answer your question?
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Otherwise, I'm sure that Professor Kokomoor would answer questions to Jack's books. So if there's anyone,
I'll be around. Yes.
Anyway, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate it.